Hello, thank you so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Rosemary Rodriguez, and I am a Senior Research Assistant here at Caltrans. I will be your moderator for today. So before we get started, I want to go ahead and cover a few housekeeping items. So first, if you have any audio problems, we strongly recommend that you dial in rather than rely on the computer audio system. If you have other challenges during the webinar, please reach out to me through the chat function, or if necessary, my email address, which you can find on the slide, yrodriguez@caltrans.org. During the presentation, your lines will be muted. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please send them using the questions box. We will answer them after everyone is done presenting. Please also know that we will be recording today's session, and they will be shared also after the presentation is over. So we're going to go through our agenda, and then we can go ahead and get started. So we will begin with an overview of the Improving School Climate in DC project from our principal investigator, Dr. Deborah Temkin. This will be followed by our Senior Technical Assistant Specialist, Dominique Perez, who will speak on the Safe School Certification Framework and her role as a TA at her schools. Lastly, we will wrap things up by hearing from Mr. Lauren Brody, principal at Tacoma Education Campus, and how he made the ISC-DC project and the Safe Schools Framework work for his school. Once everyone is done presenting, we will open it up for questions. And again, you can go ahead and put those questions throughout the presentation in your question box. So we're going to get started with Dr. Temkin, a little bit about the ISC-DC project.
Thanks so much, Rosemary. The Improving School Climate in DC project has been a project that's been going on throughout the district in both public and public charter schools for the last 4 years. It is a grant that has been sponsored by the National Institute of Justice and in partnership with Caltrans, the Office of the State Superintendent of Education, OSSE, the Office of Human Rights, and Safe School Certification, which is the program that you'll hear a little bit about. We're hoping in today's webinar that we can tell you a little bit about the project that we undertook, the lessons that we've learned, and how you might be able to apply it in your schools in the years to come. Our project offered 3 main components. First, we provided schools technical assistance on the Safe School Certification Framework over a course of 3 years. For all of the schools that we worked with, we collected school climate data, looking both for purposes of giving schools data, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, to really understand the needs of the school climate, as well as to look at the effectiveness of the Safe School Certification Program. And finally, for those schools that made progress along our framework, we provided grant funding to schools to allow them to implement evidence-based programs. I want to talk a little bit more about our data collection. I know many schools in DC are using a separate survey called Panorama. We used the survey called EdSchools, or the Education Department School Climate Survey. This survey is a free survey available to any local education agency or state education agency put out by the U.S. Department of Education that covers school climate over 3 domains. First, engagement, which encompasses topics such as cultural and linguistic competence, relationships and school participation; safety, including emotional safety, physical safety, bullying, substance use, and emergency readiness; and finally, environment, which includes the physical environment or the physical plant of a school, instructional environment, mental health, and discipline. We provide to each school who has participated with us a data report, which you can see an example of on your screen. Because of the way that the Department of Education School Climate Survey is formatted, we are able to provide schools information on how to interpret their data. This is really important because oftentimes schools are going to get handed data such as such as other school climate survey data, without guideposts to really understand whether their scores are good or not. The Department of Education provides scores along a scale score between 100 and 500, almost like an SAT score, to help schools understand where they're doing very well and where there are areas they can focus their intervention and prevention efforts on. we know from the data that we've collected over the last several years that every school has unique needs when it comes to school climate. And that's why it's so important to collect these data. On a district level, there may be several focus, for instance, on school discipline or on bullying, but each individual campus might have its own needs. So for instance, on the slide that you're seeing now, you'll see an example of 4 different schools who are participating in our project. In one school, they were doing very well in their instructional environment and substance use, but had more difficulties on student ratings of their physical environment and bullying. In another school, School 8, you'll see that they were actually doing very well with perceptions of bullying on campus and physical safety, but a little less well on the disciplinary environment and substance use. Clearly, School 5 and School 8 have different needs and have different areas on which they need to focus. So to really think about how we improve school climate, we have to understand that every school has unique strengths as well as unique areas of attention, as we saw in the previous slide. And we also need to recognize that these needs change over time. This is why it's important not to just do one data collection or and assume that that's going to be consistent over the years to come, but actually assess each school's community every year. Because we know new students are coming in every year, students are leaving every year, and so the needs of the particular students in any given year need to be addressed. And finally, we know that schools are already doing a lot to address school climate issues. This is certainly not something that's new. This is not something where schools are simply not doing anything. Often they're doing too much. They have many different programs that they are implementing, perhaps not implementing fully as designed, but not really taking the time to step back and really understanding, are those initiatives actually meeting the needs of the school community? Do those initiatives actually have the buy-in of the school community? Are they what the school community is wanting to do? And finally, are those initiatives actually effective at what they're aiming to do? We know that time is valuable, money is valuable in the school environment, and so having interventions that are effective and really fitting within the school environment is really, really critical. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dominique Paris, who's going to tell you a little bit of how we worked with schools to really understand how each school can uniquely identify what they need to improve school climate.
Thanks very much, Deb. So as Rosemary mentioned, my name is Dominique Paris. I'm a Senior Technical Assistant Specialist at Child Trends. And my role on this project was to provide direct technical assistance, working directly with some of the schools in the project to assist them in implementing the Safe School Certification Framework. So I'm going to discuss a little bit of background on the framework and then dive into more detail a few of the components of technical assistance that I provided that I found were some of the more critical pieces that schools really benefited from. So the Safe School Certification Framework is unique for a couple of reasons. One, it's not a curriculum, and I think that's the first thing that's important to remember. It is a framework. It's a structure or a guideline designed to help schools think critically and strategically about their integrated school climate efforts. It does not prescribe a one-size-fits-all solution for schools. It's rather a way for schools to organize their thinking about their school climate activities that emphasizes the importance of evidence-based decisions and practices. So what you're looking at here are what we call the 8 elements of Safe School Certification. These are really the groundwork, the guiding principles, if you will, of the framework. And I won't go into all of the detail. There's a lot more information built into this, but as we talk today, just keeping in mind that these are sort of what we describe as the key ingredients for a safe school. So making sure that you have leadership in your decision making, that your decisions are based on data, that there's buy-in throughout the school, especially at the leadership level, that you're looking at your policies and enforcement. Not only what policies do you have, but are they being implemented with fidelity? Student engagement, family and community engagement, training, providing the appropriate support for your school staff, and then the specific programs and practices. So again, there is no expectation that a school ascribe to one particular program or use a particular curriculum. In fact, what has been found is that schools have a number of these elements at play, working out in their schools. They have a number of different programs that they might be implementing and trainings that they might have, a variety of different sources of data, but might not have the opportunity and the support to think through all of those pieces and pull all of those pieces together to make a really concerted effort towards improving school climate. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical assistance that I provided. So my role as a technical assistance provider was a specialist was to assist school leaders in understanding the framework, which we just took a quick look at, promote the use of school climate data when making decisions. We relied particularly on the EdSchools survey that Dr. Temkin just referred to encourage student, family, and community engagement in decision-making, and to help schools identify existing initiatives that already meet the requirements of safe school certification. Nobody likes to reinvent the wheel, and as Dr. Temkin mentioned, time and money are precious. Anywhere, but certainly in a school setting. And so, I was very invested in helping schools identify what are the things that you've already invested in, that you are already doing, that you should get credit for and incorporate into your pursuit of safe school certification. So in the interest of time today, I'm going to discuss just two of those activities. If you could go back one slide, please. We'll just discuss promoting the use of school climate data when making decisions and encouraging student, family, and community engagement in decision making. These were some of the most, I think some of the most important, but also some of the trickiest for schools. So I wanted to spend some time today discussing those. So let's dive into promoting data-driven decision making. When I would approach a school and talk about using data, I was faced with a number of different challenges. School communities came into this project with several pre-existing experiences relating to research and data. Some of the common themes that emerged were that it's intimidating data. Some found that the idea of research and data is a little bit scary to understand. It can seem like the researchers might be speaking another language, which leads to the second point, that research is sometimes viewed as being out of touch. It can be viewed as researchers are unable to appreciate the reality of what it's like in a school building from day to day. Data can sometimes be inaccessible. Dr. Temkin mentioned this notion that some schools will, when they've experienced data, it's been in the form of a pile of numbers without much explanation or context. And that makes it really hard to make any meaning out of, or any use for that matter. So fortunately in this project, we provided our schools with data reports that included detailed and plainly written analysis of their individual school level data. And I think that was a real asset. And then lastly, data has historically been weaponized. I think a lot of school communities' only experience with data has been, or metrics, has been as a means of punishment in some way or another. So whether that meant people's jobs being on the line, programs being cut, there's also a broader historical context in which research and data has been misused to do harm, especially to communities of color and poor communities. So all of this context came into play as I walked into a school and said, "Hi, we're going to look at data and use that to make decisions." So how do we actually address some of these things? Here's a way that I address some of these different challenges. The first part to speak to the intimidation, my role as a TA provider was to walk school leaders through their data reports, through the process, promote transparency, and help them really understand how to use that report, what they were looking at, and where they could go within the report to find the information that they wanted. An analogy that I oftentimes use as well is that data and research is used as a flashlight. It's a way of sort of shining a light on what's going on in your school community, but there is a limitation to it as well. It's not going to tell you exactly what's going on, but you as a school leader who know your school community can start to fill in the gaps. And have that information be bolstered by what the data is saying and what it's telling you, so as you start to build out a really robust narrative of the school. To address this concern about research being out of touch, my approach was always to listen. It also helps that I'm not a researcher, and I oftentimes said that up front. I'm not a researcher, but I am here to translate between regular people like us and the researchers that I work with. So I spent a lot of time listening to the concerns that school communities and school leaders had, listening to what their priorities were and their hopes for their school. And I always looked for opportunities to connect back to what their data reports might be indicating, and provide opportunities to point to ways in which this framework could actually leverage or bolster their ability to achieve some of those hopes or address some of those challenges. Next, I always worked to contextualize the data, and that again stemmed a lot from the conversations that I was having with school leaders. So I encourage schools to think about how the data might fit into that overall narrative of their school, what other data sources they might have that might fill in some of the gaps and answer more of the questions, and reminding schools that they can always ask more questions and find out more, sort of find out why data is indicating one thing or the other. So I think a lot of schools were hoping and were expecting to get an answer to all of their problems with their data reports, and they were surprised, I think pleasantly perhaps, but surprised to learn that really these data reports point to more questions in some cases, but more informed questions. And then the last piece was really, this idea of empowering schools to use their data and feel as though they were actually in control and were in the driver's seat and owners of the data reports and the narrative of their school. I think that was the key part to addressing this notion of how dangerous data and research can be. So with all of that said, my role as a TA provider was to get schools from point A to point B. So to get them from their current school climate to an improved school climate through safe school certification. I needed to help them make sense of the data reports, and also help them identify evidence-based programs and practices that link to what their data is saying about their school and could potentially help improve their school climate. So what were the things that we'd pack along our way on this journey? Certainly our school climate data report. I also oftentimes referred schools to the What Works Clearinghouse and the National Center on Safe and Supportive Learning Environments, or NESLE. Those two resources are linked at the bottom of the slide. And they're really both great resources to find evidence-based programs and practices that can support school climate and as well as some classroom practices. And then the last piece that I would encourage schools to work on is developing a logic model. So how, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more, but a little bit more detail in a moment, but really helping schools think about, okay, here's what my data report says, and here's where I want to go. And here's what this evidence-based program says it can do for me. Is this a good fit? And will it get me from point A to point B? So we'll just hop over to the next slide quickly. This is a very simplified version of a logic model. So what are the inputs that you are investing? What are the activities, any sort of interventions, the specific program that you might decide you want to implement, or the policy? The outputs, what are those immediate results that you'll start to see? And then the outcomes, the long-term change that you will likely see as a result of these inputs and activities. So again, this is a very simplified version of the logic model, but for some schools this was a newer concept, and I felt that it was an important one to spend time highlighting and helping schools think through. So next, on to the student, family, and community engagement in decision making. So similarly, there were oftentimes barriers to engaging students, families, and communities in decision making, especially when it comes to data, again, because of some of the fears that I discussed earlier. Schools sometimes were fearful or concerned about exposing their problems to the larger community, feeling as though that would, they would lose credibility, perhaps. Schools experience a lot of difficulty recruiting students and families and communities in general, difficulty in maintaining their engagement once they were recruited, and scheduling. Scheduling was a real challenge for a lot of schools. So how did we address some of these? So just some guidelines that I would recommend. This notion of the fear of exposing problems, again, doing a deep dive into the data, a deeper understanding of the data and its context reduces the fear of exposure. And when you as a school leader can speak confidently about what the data are saying, you're less likely to see inquiries about that data as threatening, because you've got the answers. You understand what it means, you understand the context, and you understand where it fits in the narrative of your school. Odds are, and what I've experienced anecdotally, is that students, families, and community members are deeply familiar with the challenges of the school community, that the school community is facing as it is. So giving them the opportunity to look and examine and discuss those challenges more deeply, and to discuss their solutions really fosters a personal investment in the solutions and a feeling of empowerment about those challenges. So I would just encourage you to engage those community, family, and family members and students, because they have a lot of great ideas and they know a lot more than you might think. To the challenge of recruitment, I always recommended that schools recruit widely. So recruiting more students, more community members, more family members than they think they would actually need to be a part of their core leadership team. Send out formal and informal invitations, and collect nominations from other school community members. These were some of the strategies that schools found to be successful, and it made sure that at any school climate meeting or core leadership team meeting, that these voices were being heard, and that folks again felt invested and excited about being a part of this initiative. Relatedly, to the challenge of keeping people engaged, I always recommend that schools explicitly prioritize the voices of youth first. It can be very intimidating as a young person to walk into a room full of adults, even if they're teachers that you know and love, and especially sometimes if they're teachers, if they're parents, and maybe some community members and folks that you don't know. That experience can be a little overwhelming. And if we run a meeting as though it is just a meeting of adults, we miss out on the opportunity to hear directly from students. So treating that space, it's a little bit like a hybrid between a classroom and a meeting of adults. And I've found that schools that were successful at hitting that middle ground really benefited from hearing directly from their students. I also recommend just designating leadership roles and responsibilities for students, families, and community members that are unique to their role or their position in the school community. We've had students, in fact, who said, I want to talk to all of the students in my grade about this issue or about the particular issue at hand. And that gave them certainly a sense of ownership and a sense of purpose, and also really made sure that we were maximizing their role on the core leadership team. And consider, if you can, and I know that this can be a challenge, but consider what other supports you can provide to maybe lessen the burden of attending a meeting. That might be childcare for younger siblings, that might be a meal or transportation or community service hours. So thinking of some of the other soft incentives that really aren't so much incentives as they are supports enabling your students and families and community members to engage. And then finally, the dreaded scheduling. I have always recommended to schedule around family members' availability because that's oftentimes the most restricted, and to work from there. You can oftentimes find a staff member who can be on your committee who will make the time work, but it is very challenging to find a parent who is available from noon to 1 on a Tuesday. So working around your family members' schedule is definitely recommended. And again, as I've mentioned before, providing some of those additional supports, meals and childcare, et cetera, can reduce the burden that might otherwise make scheduling difficult. So in conclusion, I found that our schools were able to overcome their data anxiety, articulate a data-based narrative about their schools, and explore evidence-based solutions to the challenges that their data revealed, and engage the whole school community in improving the school climate. And this was, I think, what the spirit of Safe School Certification, and that was the outcome that we were hoping to see from our schools. So with that, let's hear from a school. I'm going to hand it over to Principal Lauren Brady of Tacoma Education Campus.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Brody, Principal at Tacoma Education Campus. It's great to be here with you this afternoon. Tacoma Education Campus is a preschool through 8th grade campus as part of DC Public Schools. We have our vision and mission to help make sure that our students leave Tacoma with strong academic and social skills, prepared for high school and college and their future careers. We have an arts integration program that really emphasizes helping students make real-world connections and honoring their voices. And we want to be empowered leaders for our students who foster teamwork as a powerful example to them about how to be responsible and caring citizens. And the Improving School Climate in DC initiative that we've been fortunate to be part of the last several years has helped bring us closer to realizing our school vision and mission. And it's an honor for me to share with you for a few minutes here today about some of the highlights from our participation in the project and how it's helped bring us closer to our goals in meeting the needs of our entire school community. So two of the big benefits to our school community of the Improving School Climate in DC project are related to some of the areas you just heard about. Definitely the data was big, and learning how to make the data accessible to all of our stakeholders was very important. And those barriers that were discussed earlier are definitely barriers for school communities and were barriers for our school community. And the way the data was prepared for us through the results that we got, but even more than that, how the coaching support that I received and our core leadership team received about how to discuss the data was very helpful. And the other big benefit to our school community, among the benefits, was that it helped me empower our staff and student voices by building capacity of our shared leadership and by helping to build my capacity as well. So I'll go into a little bit more detail with each of those big benefits that we experienced. So in terms of making the climate data accessible to stakeholders, our core leadership team, which we also called our school culture committee informally because there is some different language in DC public schools in terms of the name of the committee, but when I use them, they're interchangeable, and core leadership team is where we were focused for our project work. And the core leadership team was trained by our specialists from Child Trends to evaluate the school climate data reports 2 to 3 times per school year during our core leadership team meetings. Our meetings were monthly, but we really focused in on that data 3 times in a lot of depth during the school year, and the specialist was very supportive of that process. Our core leadership team members have presented then overviews of that learning to our entire staff, and that helped increase our buy-in from our staff about the whole idea of climate data having value and it being able to tell us about where it is that we need to grow and learn as a school community, and showing us that we can use that information to make changes that help all of us. Our student leadership team was also trained to discuss and provide feedback on school climate, again, 2 to 3 times per school year during the student leadership team meetings, again, with the support of our Child Trends specialists. And the coaching and the consulting really increased my capacity as a school leader to facilitate the climate data discussions, because there's so much information as school leaders that we take in every day, qualitative and quantitative, and there are a lot of quantitative surveys that come our way, and it can be overwhelming. And part of what I learned that was so helpful was to contextualize the data, but not having to do it myself, but learning how to facilitate conversations with staff members and parents in order to help build that and contextualize what the information meant and how to use it together. And that was very powerful. And that goes right along with empowering staff and student voices, because it was a really good point mentioned earlier that oftentimes our school community members know the challenges that we're facing as a school community. However, if we're not talking about it together, that's one additional barrier to being able to make positive change together. And part of what I found is just the discussions themselves, like taking a couple of the responses from the survey and just having a 15-20 minute conversation with it as a staff team with some parents or with students and asking them to reflect on different kinds of questions. Like that discussion itself helped to improve climate. So our student leadership team was a group of 9 middle school students who represented 6th through 8th grades who learned to discuss what school climate is and why it's important. And part of what I learned as a school leader was to take a step back and just talk about what school climate means, to build a common vocabulary together with the students. They learned to raise and discuss difficult issues such as discipline fairness and teacher-student relationships, and to have those conversations in a respectful way that took into account multiple perspectives. The students learned to provide both critical feedback of what they thought needed to change, but also to engage in self-reflection about what they could do to help make a particular classroom climate stronger, or what they can do to help be more positive together with their classmates. And then the core leadership team has been a group of 10 to 12 staff members and some parents who learned to analyze the school climate data and to gain comfort again in understanding how to use the data. And one of the important growth areas there where we made progress was that we learned to voice disagreement constructively, to acknowledge different viewpoints, and then to use the data to recommend and make actionable changes. And that's where the empowerment I felt really came from. It came from, here's this data, we're taking it in, we're discussing it, we're exploring different viewpoints about it, and then we're deciding on some actions that we can take together to help improve a particular area of school climate together. And being able to turn the data into an action helped increase buy-in and helped empower staff and student voices. there are definitely challenges, as have been mentioned throughout, that are really important challenges to discuss and to collectively, as school communities and as education partners, figure out how to marshal our resources and improve our school climates on behalf of our students and families and our staff members. And one of the challenges has been parent participation, as was mentioned in the core leadership team meetings. Scheduling is part of that challenge. Also, the keeping to the frequency of the monthly meetings, and there are many challenges in terms of for parents in having their availability, and for us in figuring out the right availability to have for staff members and parents in terms of that scheduling. And then the surveys, getting parent participation in the surveys among many competing surveys, among many competing meetings and activities after school, and kind of cutting through all, or getting through all of that to emphasize that how important the school climate work is. So that's something we're still working on as a school community. Is an important challenge for us to continue addressing. With all the different committees, and some that are required, like local school advisory team is required, school community in these public schools, PTO or PTA committees for parent-teacher organizations, other committees that we have at the school. Maintaining a consistent thread of communication through all of our different committees and meetings is really hard. And it's important for there not to be one keeper of all that communication and thread of information, but figuring out the best ways to share it consistently with all stakeholders is a challenge that I'm continuing to focus on and explore in order to better improve that communication throughout our school community. I mentioned the competing surveys. Definitely there are a lot of different kinds of surveys, whether they're surveys for teachers and other staff members that they take several times a year, as well as for parents when we're asking them to complete surveys. And it becomes challenging to explore it becomes challenging to explain what all the different surveys are and why they're each important, and to get buy-in in completing them each time. And then the grant funding. So we've become eligible as a school through this project for fantastic grant funding to support school climate work, but there are definitely technical hurdles that we're working to overcome in finalizing the procurement process and getting the grants approved and turning them into programs for our school. Overall, I've learned so much from being part of this project over the last 3 years or so. By working closely with the climate specialists, I gained skills in how to facilitate data discussions that are less likely to put folks on the defensive, or less likely for me to even be defensive, and more likely to lead to constructive solutions and greater awareness throughout the school community. And I welcome questions for me or for any of the other panelists. Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions. As a reminder, if you have any questions for either of the panelists, so that's Dr. Temkin, Dominique, and Mr. Brody, you may send them using the questions box on your panel. Once I receive it, I will read it out loud. One of the questions that we have, and this is mostly for Dr. Temkin, but anyone else can go ahead and chime in. What is the best way to use this information? So the information that we received in this webinar, what is the best way to use it in our schools?
Absolutely. So this particular project was a pilot. We are currently working with OHR and OSSE on ways to help extend this to other schools. But we really want to hear from you about what resources would be most useful for you to apply some of the lessons learned that you heard today. We are planning to release a toolkit towards the end of the school year for you to start thinking about and planning on how you might be able to use this information going forward. We know that DCPS is certainly collecting school climate data, not exactly the same as the ones that we've been using, but similar, and certainly the principles of state school certification can be used with those survey data as well. So we are really encouraging you, once we have that toolkit in place, we will certainly send it out to you. But if there's anything in particular that you think would be useful, we would love to hear from you. Please reach out to Yosemarie, who you saw her email address at the beginning of this webinar. And any comments or any questions, you can certainly put it in the chat box right now as well. But our hope is for you to start thinking about not just receiving school climate data, but how you might use it to facilitate conversations and actually work towards identifying strengths and identifying areas where you might need to invest some programming or practices or other strategies.
Thank you. Our other question is for Mr. Brody. How do you fit this work with competing challenges? So, one of the things that we talked about was that there's a lot of things that schools are asked to do. So what did you find useful to try to make this work with all of the other things that you were asked to do?
That's an important question. Thank you so much for asking that. And one of the important ways to address that is to prioritize how important elevating staff and student voices in climate work is to improving school climate work. And so only something that as a school leader I feel is essential to furthering the progress of the school community is something that is going to get the limited time resources that I have in order to do that. And so I definitely prioritize scheduling the school culture committee core leadership team meetings, and I prioritized developing meeting times with our student leadership teams as well, and making sure that those were calendared. The coaching part of it was definitely really helpful. The coaching, I would say, actually was essential to my investment that I made in this process, because the coaching was also supportive of my reflections on our school and contextualizing where our school was and what the most important areas of growth were for our school, but also reflecting on my leadership and where my leadership was having the most positive effect on our school climate work, and where I needed to learn from how I saw my coach model some of the discussions in order to make some more progress. And so I think the coaching gave me the motivation, and also just seeing how someone else is able to facilitate some of this conversation and learn from seeing and doing, that gave me more confidence. And so that combined with making sure that I made it a priority, because I really believed and still do that this is so important to having the kind of inclusive school community that will ultimately make us not just successful, but successful over the long term, was really important.
Thank you. And then our last question, probably, Dominique and Mr. Brody. Mr. Brody talked a little bit about making it a priority. Dominique, what are some things that you saw that helped your schools make this work a priority, but also build buy-in from their staff?
That is a great question. So I think the first piece that helped schools really prioritize this work was that it really does have to come from the top down. So having the principal fully on board, as Mr. Brody was just explaining, makes a huge difference, because having that leadership buy-in is a key piece. And so oftentimes my conversations would start with principals and trying to explain a little bit about the benefits of the framework and what the school stands to gain. And in terms of fostering buy-in, I think buy-in and ownership of the process go hand in hand. So allowing, creating transparency around the surveys. What are they? Why do they exist? Where is this data going? How is it being used? How is the school planning to use these data? That helps, because I think oftentimes the surveys are the first point of contact that the broader school community has had with this project, whether it's helping to administer the student surveys, taking a staff survey, or even pushing out the parent and family surveys. And so understanding kind of where that information is going and how it has the potential to be turned into actionable change at the school, I think that has been something that schools who have been successful at painting that picture for their larger community have also been successful at getting buy-in across the board. It's easier for anybody in a school community to say, here are the things that I think are wrong, but it's actually a lot harder sometimes for a school to say, here's an initiative that I think will actually make it better. But if we can allow that transparency and bring people along on the journey, that has had, I think, positive impacts on promoting buy-in.
All right, thank you so much. We're just going to give you guys a few minutes if you have any questions. Otherwise, we can go ahead and start wrapping up. So if you have any questions, just send them to me via the questions box, and I will post them to the panelists. All right, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up the webinar. Thank you again for joining us today. In a couple of days, you will receive a recording of the webinar so that you can hear our presenters talk. And just, if you have any other questions, just please send us the questions. My email was at the beginning of the presentation, yrodriguez@childtrends.org. And thank you so much.
Thank you.